.NET for Devices presents EvenTiles Part 4, the settings page. Hello once again. Today we're gonna extend the functionality of EvenTiles by creating a settings page. And the idea of that settings page for later on already is to have some text that we can write on the backside of a secondary tile. And in order to do that, first we're gonna get a placeholder. We're gonna create a placeholder to store that secondary text. We're gonna use Visual Studio for that, and in our app.xaml.cs file I'm just gonna create a few variables, or one variable and a constant string. And inside that constant string, what we're gonna store is some default text that we can display on the backside of a secondary tile. And remember, the whole purpose of our sample application is to have a secondary tile available on the start screen to make the number of tiles on that start screen, even if you have an odd number of tiles. And I want to have both the backside and the front side of that secondary tile containing some text, and on the backside of that secondary tile we have the possibility to show some default text, being having an even number of tiles on the start screen. And now we're also going to create a property, and it's going to be a public property to actually get the actual back content that needs to be displayed on the backside of a secondary tile. That's just going to be a simple property there. And then the last thing we need to do is assign the default string to the actual string in the constructor. Okay, and let's go on looking at the user interface for our settings page. Now I'm gonna open that settings page inside Expression Blend, because Expression Blend as a designer tool is a little bit easier in creating user interfaces. So that's what we're gonna do. First off, I'm gonna make sure that I have my entire phone page visible inside Expression Blend, and then we're gonna add UI elements to the layout root, which is a grid control. First thing I'm going to do is add a text block. I'm going to add that text block to that content panel, and you can see that nicely lined up there on the left upper side inside our grid control. I'm going to change the text property of that text block. So we're going to make sure to give an indication there of what we're going to do with the rest of our UI controls. Okay, that is done. Now the other thing I'm gonna do is immediately under that text block I want to add a text box, and the text box is a UI element in which you can add data. And what I want to do immediately is give my text box a name, because by giving it a name I can access that UI control also from inside code later on. The next thing I want to do is set some more properties on my text box, and I can just search for properties. And the first property I want to set is the maximum length. I want to limit that to 45 characters. I'm also adding a button, and I'm also going to give that button a name, and you can see all those UI elements being stacked on top of each other right now. So what I'm going to do is make sure that all those individual UI elements are grouped together in a stack, and I can do that by just right clicking on them and group them into a stack panel. And now they are nicely displayed next to each other. I'm going to change the order, and also I don't want to have them displayed next to each other, but I want to have them displayed on top of each other. So that's something we're going to fix right now by setting one of the properties inside the stack panel. I'm going to change the orientation from horizontal to vertical. And then the other thing I need to do is make sure that I'm just going to fix the size of my stack panel. And now I have all those elements nicely on top of each other. So first I have my text block, then my text box, and I still need to set the text property of my text box to nothing. So let's do that right away. And I have a button, and that button needs to have, of course, a more meaningful content property. So what we're gonna do with that button is restore a default text, and that's the default text we just added in Visual Studio a couple of minutes ago. Now our UI looks decent, although that text block is not nicely aligned with the rest of the UI controls. So I'm just going to set its margin, let's say, to 12 pixels, so it's going to line up pretty with the other UI controls that we are having inside our grid. Now the next thing I'm gonna do is add an event handler to my text box, and each time the text is changed inside my text box, I want to have some code being executed, and that event handler has just been generated for me inside Expression Blend. I'm gonna go back to our design page, and we're gonna do something similar for our button. Each time the user clicks on the button, I want an event to be executed or an event handler to run, and we just did that. And the functionality we want to achieve is something I'm gonna talk about later, but let's first add another UI control, and this is one from the Silverlight toolkit. It's gonna be a toggle switch, and we're just gonna add that to our content panel as well. So I don't want to have that to be part of our stack panel, but just of our grid that is the content panel. But I want to have it lined up differently, so I want to have that toggle switch on the bottom of my screen. And in order to do that, I'm going to add a number of row definitions inside that grid being my content panel. I'm just going to add 3 different row definitions, and the first one should be a row with an automatic height. So I'm going to just modify that. It should just be large enough to hold my stack panel. Then my last row should have enough room to just show my toggle switch, so that's going to be automatic as well. And the row in the middle, I'm just going to use that to fill up the entire remaining space. Now that has happened, but now I need to make sure that my toggle switch is going to be hosted in row number 2, because we start counting with 0 there. And here is our layout that looks a little bit better already. Now what I need to do is fix my margins on that toggle switch, because I still had some margins there. Now they're gone, and it's nicely hosted in its own separate row, as is the stack panel containing my button and the other controls. What I want to do also is make my button invisible, and that button should only be visible if the text being displayed in my text box does not contain a default text. And what you can see automatically, that middle row just adjusted its size when my button became invisible. What I do like to do for my toggle switch is not have a separate content and a separate header, so I'm just gonna fill out my content property, and I'm gonna make the header property empty. Now that's a matter of personal taste. I like it in this way. And I'm gonna save my entire UI here before going back to Visual Studio, which we're doing now. And Visual Studio already noticed that we had changes, so I just allowed it to read in my project again. Then I'm going to rebuild my solution again, just to make sure that those modifications in XAML are now incorporated inside Visual Studio as well. And now the next thing we're going to do is add some code, add some functionality inside our event handlers. So let's just navigate to one of our event handlers. So here's Visual Studio's text editor, and you can see event handlers created for us with some nice to-do comment. But first what I want to do is add some functionality that needs to be executed each time we are navigating to this page, and also each time we're navigating from this page. So the first thing we're going to do is add a already existing method being onNavigated to and onNavigated from. We're going to override the existing methods. We're still going to make sure to call the base functionality, so we leave that base onNavigated to, we leave that intact, but we're just going to add some more functionality here. And what we want to do is set the text property of our back content text box. We're going to set that to the actual back content that we defined inside our app.xaml.cs file, and that was that property we created there. And I'm also going to check whether or not we need to display our button, and we're only going to display our button if the text inside our text block is not equal to the default text, because then we have a reason to actually restore the default text. And we're just going to use some string comparison there to compare the actual content with the default content. And that is all the functionality we always need to execute each time the user navigates to our settings page. So the button is going to be invisible when our text box contains the default text, otherwise it's going to be visible. And exactly that same code, so the code to hide or make the button visible. We're going to copy that, because each time we are changing something inside our text box, we want to execute that same code. So if we are getting back to default text, we're going to hide the button, otherwise we're going to show the button. When we are navigating away from our page, what we want to do is store the text property of our text box in that property we created in our app.xaml.cs file. And then finally, if the user clicks the restore button, what we want to set is the text property on our text box. We're going to set that to our default text that again was defined in our app.xaml.cs file. And with that we have all functionality. So let's build our solution and let's just run it in the emulator. So we're going to start the emulator, or we're going to start the application inside the emulator, and here is the application. We're going to go to our settings page, and what you can see is that, hey, we have our default string initialized, and if I'm entering some more data, you see our button appearing. If I delete that same character again, we have our default text back, and our button disappears again. So let me just enter something again, and here is the button. What you can also see is that we have a limit of 45 characters, so if I try to enter more characters, nothing happened. And if I click the button, we restore the default text. So in other words, pretty much functionality already inside our little settings screen. Now I don't have a default text here, and I'm going to navigate back to our main page and then navigate back to our settings page, and you can see that, hey, our text has been saved. So that's pretty cool. If I again restore the default text, the button disappears. But let's take a look what's happening if I'm entirely quitting the application and then starting the application again. So that's what we're going to do right now. And let's see what text is visible here. And that is again the default text. Meaning, in other words, that we did not save the text the user entered. Because that is going to be part of the next episode of EvenTiles.